Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find a man standing at the foot of your bed. He's wearing a ski mask. He's holding a flashlight and a gun. The beam blinds you before you even have time to scream. And then, in a voice so calm it's almost cold, he whispers, "Don't move, or I'll kill you." For years across California, people lived that nightmare. Ordinary families in quiet neighborhoods. Parents, children, young couples just starting their lives. He crept through windows, tied his victims, and vanished before police even knew he'd been there. He didn't leave fingerprints. He didn't leave a trace. He was everywhere and nowhere. Tonight, you'll hear the story of the man who terrorized an entire state. The one they called the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, the Golden State Killer. A predator so precise, so methodical, that for 40 years he remained a ghost. But when he was finally caught, the world discovered the most chilling truth of all. The monster who'd hunted them had once sworn to protect them. If this story is gripping already, make sure you stay to the end, because the way he was finally unmasked will make your skin crawl. It started small, almost invisible. 1974, Sacramento County, California. A peaceful suburb where the biggest worry was mowing the lawn before dinner. People left their doors unlocked, bikes on the driveway, and windows open to catch the evening breeze. But that year, something dark moved in. At first, it was little things. Someone's gate left open. Footprints in the flower bed. Dogs barking at nothing. Residents brushed it off, until they realized they were being watched. Soon after, strange phone calls started. A click, a breath, then silence. Sometimes a whisper, "I'm coming." Most people hung up and tried to forget. They couldn't have known the man on the other end was already inside their neighborhood, mapping every street, memorizing their routines, learning who lived where. Then came the first attack. A young woman, home alone, woken by the sound of glass shattering. A man appeared in her doorway, mask over his face, knife in hand. He tied her up, whispered things she would never repeat, and disappeared into the night. The police called it a burglary gone wrong. But a week later, it happened again. And again. The intruder was calm, controlled. He didn't just break in, he hunted. He'd prowl through homes, switching off lights, leaving the people inside trapped in darkness. He tied them with shoelaces he brought himself. He spoke softly but with absolute control. He made them believe any wrong move meant death. By the time investigators realized they were dealing with a serial predator, he already had a name, the East Area Rapist. The attacks followed a horrifying pattern. Late at night, in middle-class neighborhoods. He'd force the man to lie face down, stack dishes on his back and tell him, "If I hear those plates rattle, you're both dead." Then he'd turn to the woman, whispering cruel things while pretending the man's life balanced on a single sound. When police arrived hours later, the plates were still perfectly stacked. He knew their homes. He knew their habits. Sometimes he'd eat food from their fridge, drink a beer, even stay for hours after the assault. He moved like he'd been trained for it, efficient, calculated, unshakably calm. Detectives began to wonder if he had police or military experience. The city panicked. People installed floodlights, bought guard dogs, nailed windows shut. Gun sales exploded. No one felt safe. Couples slept in shifts. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled the streets. Yet he kept coming. He'd strike blocks away from where police cruisers had just passed. He was always one step ahead. And he was watching them too. Victims later remembered seeing strange cars parked near their homes in the days before the attacks. Sometimes, small scratches on their window frames, as if someone had tested them. He would call before the assault, hang up, then call again days after, just breathing on the line. He wanted them to know he could come back anytime. The press couldn't get enough of it. Every newspaper headline screamed about the East Area Rapist. Talk shows debated his motives. Some described him as a ghost, others as a genius. The attention only seemed to feed him. Each new article, each new police press conference was like fuel to the fire. Detectives formed task forces, but leads went nowhere. The attacker seemed to anticipate their every move. He changed cities, changed tactics, vanished for weeks, then struck again without warning. One officer described it as chasing smoke. The crimes grew bolder. He started attacking couples who slept beside their children. He'd tie the parents, place a knife beside the baby, and whisper, "Don't make a sound." The cruelty wasn't random, it was deliberate. He wanted power, fear, complete control. Investigators believed he might live among his victims. Maybe even join the search parties afterward, blending in as just another frightened neighbor. They were right. One night, a deputy nearly caught him. He spotted a man fleeing through a backyard, chased him, and fired a shot. The bullet missed. The man vanished into the dark. When they followed the footprints, they ended abruptly, as if the suspect had lifted off the ground and disappeared. As the assaults mounted, dozens by 1978, the community began to unravel. People accused neighbors, co-workers, even friends. The fear was toxic. No one trusted anyone. The man's control extended beyond his victims. He controlled the entire city. And then came the murders. February 1978, Brian and Katie Majori were walking their dog in their Sacramento neighborhood when they noticed a man following them. They tried to run. The man chased them down and shot them both dead. Witnesses heard the gunfire, but by the time police arrived, he was gone. The murders were fast, efficient, professional. It was the same signature, the same ghost, only now he was killing. It was the first time the East Area Rapist left bodies behind. But it wouldn't be the last. What no one realized was that he was changing. He wasn't satisfied with fear anymore. He needed complete destruction. He moved south, to new cities, new counties, taking his methods with him. The attacks stopped in Sacramento, but reports of brutal killings began surfacing hundreds of miles away, in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange County. Couples found bound, bludgeoned, murdered. The cases didn't seem connected. Different jurisdictions, different names. But it was the same man. Only years later would detectives connect the dots through DNA evidence. By then, he'd become the original Night Stalker, the same monster, just wearing a new mask. But back in the late 70s, no one knew that. In Sacramento, people thought the nightmare was over. They moved on, built new lives, tried to forget. The attacker didn't forget. Sometimes he called his past victims, whispering into the phone, "Remember when we were together?" Then a click. Dial tone. He wanted them to relive the fear over and over. He had vanished, but his shadow still lingered over every home he touched. Police had no suspect, no clues, no idea who he was. He left behind shoe prints, rope fibers, and pain, but nothing that could name him. By 1980, he was gone. Just gone. And the state that had once lived in terror was left with only unanswered questions. Who was he? Where did he go? Would he ever strike again? For decades, the case grew cold. Files gathered dust in evidence rooms. Detectives retired. Survivors tried to rebuild. The world moved on. But the monster was still out there, aging, living a normal life, blending in like he always had. Waiting for the world to forget him. He thought he'd won. But 40 years later, technology would finally reveal the face behind the mask. And when it did, California learned that the man who had terrorized their nights wasn't some shadow or drifter. He was a husband, a father, a neighbor, a man who'd once worn a police badge. And that's when everything changed. When the attacks stopped in Sacramento, people breathed again. The city tried to heal, to forget the fear that had ruled their nights. But the man they called the East Area Rapist hadn't stopped. He had simply moved. Down south into new hunting grounds. Into Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange County, the golden edge of California, where palm trees swayed and ocean breezes rolled through picture-perfect suburbs. Nobody there had any idea that a predator had just arrived. The killings began quietly, almost unnoticed. A couple found murdered in their home. Another bludgeoned to death while sleeping. Each case had details that made detectives uneasy: bindings, broken glass, open drawers, things that didn't belong in a simple burglary. But without DNA, the technology of the time couldn't connect them. Different departments handled different cases. No one saw the pattern. To the public, these were isolated horrors. To the killer, they were a continuation of the same dark ritual. He was evolving. The man who once left victims alive was now leaving bodies. In December 1979, a couple named Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were found murdered in Santa Barbara County. Their bindings were still on their wrists. Detectives noted that the cords were tied tightly, methodically, like the work of someone who'd done it many times before. The house showed no sign of forced entry. Whoever had killed them knew exactly how to get inside. The next year, Lyman and Charlene Smith were attacked and murdered in their Ventura home. They were found tied up with a nautical knot so complex that investigators were convinced the killer had military or sailing experience. He had used a log from their own fireplace as a weapon. The brutality was beyond anything local police had seen. And then another. Keith and Patrice Harrington, bludgeoned to death in their Orange County home. Then Manuela Withun, then Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. Always couples. Always at night. Always the same eerie quiet precision. But police didn't realize these cases were linked, not yet. Different counties, different sheriffs, different evidence rooms. They didn't talk to each other, didn't compare notes. The man used that to his advantage. He slipped between jurisdictions like smoke, knowing no one was connecting the dots. For the victims, the horror was the same story rewritten again and again. Neighbors would say, they were such a nice couple. Quiet. No enemies. Then the police tape would go up and the headlines would follow. Double murder shocks local community. It became a pattern. But the pattern had a name. Years later, investigators would give him one, the original Night Stalker. And just like that, his shadow spread. What made this killer so terrifying wasn't just what he did, but how he did it. He planned. He studied. He adapted. Each attack was like a military operation. He chose neighborhoods near open spaces, creeks, fields, canals, easy to escape through on foot. He parked blocks away, slipped through yards, and entered silently through sliding doors or unlocked windows. He would sometimes leave ligatures pre-tied, waiting in the dark for the right moment. It wasn't random. It was obsession. And as his crimes escalated, so did his need for control. Survivors of his earlier attacks in Sacramento had described a man who sometimes spoke to himself, one voice angry, one frightened. He'd mutter things like, "I hate you, Bonnie," or, "You'll be quiet now." Police never figured out who Bonnie was. But whoever she was, she lived in his head. By the early 80s, the killings stopped as suddenly as they'd started. There were no more attacks, no new evidence, no leads. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. For years, the case sat cold. Detectives retired, new ones came and went, but the trail was frozen. The East Area Rapist in the north. The original Night Stalker in the south. Two monsters with the same signature of fear. But no one realized they were the same man. And while police chased ghosts, the real man lived quietly among them. He married, had children, worked jobs, paid taxes. He went to grocery stores, mowed his lawn, waved at neighbors. To anyone who met him, he was just another face in the crowd. A man who blended in so perfectly that no one ever suspected the darkness hiding behind his polite smile. But even though he'd stopped killing, he hadn't stopped remembering. Decades later, investigators would find that some victims received phone calls from him years after their attacks. His voice older, raspier, but still filled with menace. One woman picked up her phone in the 90s and heard the same whisper she'd heard 2 decades earlier, "I'll kill you." The police were haunted too. Detectives who'd worked the case in the 70s described it as a ghost that never left them. Every new cold case they opened, every unsolved file they read, they'd think, could this be him? For the victims who survived, the fear never faded. They locked their doors even in broad daylight. They slept with lights on. Some moved across the country trying to outrun the memories. But trauma like that never goes away. As the years passed, technology began to change. DNA testing became more advanced. By the late 1990s, investigators started re-examining old evidence from unsolved cases, clothing, ropes, bits of hair, anything that could still hold a genetic clue. That's when it happened. The DNA from the East Area Rapist attacks in Sacramento matched the DNA from the murders in Southern California. Two monsters, the rapist and the Night Stalker, were one and the same person. It was a stunning revelation. The killer who had tormented Northern California and the one who had murdered couples in the South were the same man. One human being responsible for more than a decade of terror. The name Golden State Killer was born. It was the only name big enough to contain all his crimes. But even then, police had no match. They knew the DNA profile, but it didn't match anyone in the system. He wasn't in any database, wasn't a registered offender. It was like he didn't exist. By this point, the 2000s had come and gone. The world had moved into the digital age. But the Golden State Killer remained hidden, living an ordinary life somewhere in California. It wasn't until 2018 that everything changed. That year, investigators tried something new, something revolutionary. They took the DNA from one of the crime scenes and uploaded it to a public genealogy website. These were sites where people shared their DNA to find long-lost relatives or trace their ancestry. Within days, they found a partial match. Not the killer himself, but a distant relative. That was all they needed. A small team of detectives and genealogists began building a family tree from that one connection, tracing cousins, grandparents, great-uncles, branch by branch, until they found one name that fit perfectly. A man in his 70s, living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. A man who had once been a police officer in the 1970s. A man who had been fired for stealing a hammer and dog repellent. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Investigators started watching him. They followed him to stores, to work, to his home. One day, they collected DNA from something he'd thrown away, a tissue from his trash. When they tested it, the results were undeniable. It was a perfect match. After 40 years, the Golden State Killer had finally been found. When police surrounded his house and arrested him, he looked like nothing. A frail, aging man, retired, quiet, unassuming. But inside that man lived the memories of 50 rapes and 13 murders. Detectives searched his home and found boxes filled with random trinkets, earrings, photos, rings, small keepsakes that matched items stolen from crime scenes decades ago. Each one a souvenir of terror. When they told his neighbors who he was, they couldn't believe it. They described him as polite, helpful, normal. One said he was the kind of man who would wave when you walked your dog. They had no idea. But deep inside, Joseph DeAngelo had never changed. He had just learned how to wear a mask. The man who once crept through windows and whispered death threats in the dark was now the old man next door. For the families of his victims, the arrest was both relief and heartbreak. Decades had passed. Some of the victims had died without seeing justice. Others broke down in tears when they finally heard his name. The monster who had haunted their lives had a face, a history, and a home just like theirs. But before the world saw him in court, before the confessions, before the sentencing, there was still one final chapter to write, one that would expose the full extent of his crimes and finally bring the truth into the light. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had been a faceless ghost, a name whispered in evidence rooms and in the nightmares of those he left behind. Detectives had retired, died, or simply given up. But in the late 2010s, a revolution quietly took shape, not in a lab filled with crime scene photos, but in the digital world. It began with a few determined souls, retired cops, amateur genealogists, and a new generation of data detectives who refused to let the trail go cold. Among them was Paul Holes, a seasoned investigator from Contra Costa County who had chased this phantom for decades. Holes couldn't shake the case, not through promotions, not through retirement. It haunted him. By 2017, DNA technology had advanced to levels unimaginable back in the 70s and 80s. For years, the Golden State Killer's DNA had been sitting in evidence lockers, a genetic fingerprint with no name attached. But now, websites like Gmatch allowed people to upload their DNA to find relatives. It was meant for family history, but suddenly, it became a weapon against the unknown. When detectives uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile into the database, they weren't looking for him directly. They were looking for his bloodline. The match they got wasn't the killer himself, but distant relatives, a web of cousins, aunts, uncles, all connected by strands of inherited code. Piece by piece, genealogists traced backward, narrowing in on a single family tree that pointed toward one man, Joseph James DeAngelo. He wasn't on anyone's radar anymore. In fact, DeAngelo seemed like any ordinary suburban grandfather. He lived quietly in Citrus Heights, California. A tidy yard, a single-story home. He went grocery shopping, argued with neighbors about noise, and waved to kids on bikes. But when investigators looked deeper, the coincidences began to burn like warning flares. DeAngelo had once been a police officer, trained, disciplined, and intimately familiar with how to manipulate a crime scene. He'd served in Auburn, not far from many of the early attacks. And when the string of crimes had begun to fade in one region, it was often around the time DeAngelo had moved or changed jobs. The puzzle pieces that never made sense before suddenly aligned. His military background explained his precision. His law enforcement career explained his ability to evade capture. His sudden outbursts, reported by neighbors, hinted at the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. But in detective work, suspicious isn't enough. They needed proof. Hard proof. So the team devised a plan straight out of a movie script. They began to surveil DeAngelo's home, quietly collecting discarded items. A tissue, something from his garbage, anything that might hold DNA. When the lab tested it against the preserved genetic sample from the Golden State Killer's crimes, there was no question. It was him. After more than 4 decades, the man who had terrorized California's suburbs, who had shattered lives, families, and the illusion of safety, had finally been unmasked. On April 24, 2018, authorities moved in. Police cars lined the street as tactical units surrounded the home. Neighbors peered through curtains, unaware that the quiet retiree next door was one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. DeAngelo stepped out of his garage, startled by the sight of armed officers. He didn't run. He didn't fight. When they told him he was under arrest, he simply muttered something under his breath. Later, as detectives questioned him, he whispered about an inner voice, a force he called Jerry, claiming it had driven his actions. But to the victims' families, that explanation felt hollow. Nothing could justify what he'd done. As news broke, the world reacted with shock. For decades, this monster had been a myth, a faceless shadow who seemed beyond human reach. Now he had a face, a name, a past. The Golden State Killer was no longer a ghost story. He was a man. In the days that followed, investigators searched his home and property. They found boxes, tools, and small trophies, echoes of the man's long, dark past. Every drawer, every shed, seemed to hold traces of his secret life. But the most haunting detail wasn't what he'd kept, it was what he'd hidden. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless. He'd shout in his backyard sometimes, cursing to himself, often about nothing. He was known to get furious over small slights, barking dogs, loud motorcycles, kids playing too close to his fence. But nobody suspected the depth of his anger. Nobody imagined that behind that suburban smile was the same man who once tied couples up in their homes and whispered threats in the dark. When the victims and their families heard the news, it was a mix of relief and heartbreak. Some cried. Some screamed. Others just sat in silence. After decades of waiting, they finally had a name, but justice had taken nearly a lifetime to arrive. Many of the parents of victims had died before seeing this day. For those who were still alive, the arrest reopened wounds they thought had scarred over. As the media swarmed his neighborhood, people struggled to reconcile the two faces of Joseph DeAngelo. On one hand, a quiet ex-cop, father and grandfather. On the other, a sadistic predator who'd stalked women, broken into homes, and destroyed lives with a kind of surgical cruelty. Prosecutors now faced a monumental task, tying a lifetime of crimes together. There were murders, assaults, and burglaries spanning multiple jurisdictions, counties, and decades. The list of victims was long, and every case carried its own pain, its own story. But DNA was the thread that linked them all. Behind the scenes, Paul Holes, who had retired just before the arrest, finally felt something close to closure. He'd spent half his life chasing this ghost. When he saw DeAngelo's face on the news, he didn't feel triumph, just a quiet, heavy relief. Still, the public wanted answers. Why did he do it? What drove him to terrorize strangers? How could someone sworn to protect become a symbol of fear? DeAngelo never offered a clear explanation. During his arrest, his calm demeanor never cracked. His eyes were cold, detached, almost analytical. The man who once taunted police with calls and letters now said nothing. But the silence spoke volumes. Because in that silence, everyone could feel the truth, that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they live next door. They smile. They wave. They mow their lawns. And at night, they remember everything they've done. By 2019, prosecutors had charged Joseph DeAngelo with multiple counts of murder and dozens of assaults. His trial would take time, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. After years of fear, grief, and frustration, the victims finally had what they'd been denied for so long: a name, a face, and accountability. But even as justice loomed, questions lingered. How had he managed to live unnoticed for so long? How many times had police unknowingly crossed paths with him? And perhaps most chillingly, were there more victims never found, stories never told, crimes that would remain buried with time? As one detective put it, "We didn't just catch a killer. We caught the ghost that's been haunting California for 40 years. But the story of Joseph DeAngelo, the man behind the mask, was still unfolding. Because beneath the courtroom lights, as victims prepared to confront the man who had once ruled their nightmares, the world would finally see him stripped of power, not as a monster, but as an aging man, frail, pathetic, and mortal. And yet, even then, the fear he'd created still hung in the air. The echoes of footsteps outside dark windows, the whispered breath in the night, the chilling certainty that evil had once lived among them. When Joseph James DeAngelo finally entered a courtroom, it wasn't as the powerful predator who once terrorized an entire state, but as a frail, old man in an orange jumpsuit, his face hidden behind a mask of age and silence. For decades, he had ruled through fear, slipping through darkness like a phantom. But now, the world was staring right back at him. The courtroom was packed. Survivors, family members, and investigators filled every seat. Some had waited 40 years for this day. Others came for those who couldn't, parents who had died before seeing justice, victims who never lived to speak their truth. As prosecutors read the charges, 13 counts of murder and multiple counts of rape and kidnapping, the list went on and on, the years stacking up like bricks in a wall of horror. DeAngelo didn't look up. He didn't speak. For months, he said almost nothing. But every time his name was mentioned, every time a victim's story was told, the silence in that courtroom grew heavier. The evidence was undeniable. DNA had sealed his fate. There were recordings, survivor testimonies, patterns that fit like puzzle pieces, the same knots tied, the same words whispered, the same calculated cruelty repeated again and again. He had taunted police with phone calls, mocked his victims, and lived decades as a free man. Now, the weight of all those years pressed down on him at once. In June 2020, DeAngelo stood to enter his plea. His voice was barely audible, thin, trembling, as if it belonged to someone else. He whispered, "Guilty," again and again, as prosecutors read through crime after crime, victim after victim. There were no theatrics, no excuses. Just the quiet confession of a man who had run out of places to hide. When it came time for the victims to speak, the courtroom shifted. Women who had once been silenced by fear stood tall before him. Men who had been young husbands decades earlier, now old, weathered, and unbroken, looked him in the eye and reminded him of what he had done. One woman described waking up to find him in her room, the beam of his flashlight blinding her before the rope burned against her wrists. Another recalled how he whispered, "Don't move," while her husband lay helpless in the next room. Decades later, those voices still trembled, but this time, they weren't afraid. They were reclaiming their power. Some cried. Some shouted. Some just stared. But every word chipped away at the myth he had built, the myth of the unstoppable, invisible killer. When DeAngelo was given the chance to respond, his lawyer wheeled him forward. He leaned into the microphone, frail and shaking. His words were soft, almost rehearsed. "I've listened to all your statements. Each one of them. "I am truly sorry to everyone I have hurt." But for many, it wasn't remorse, it was survival. He had avoided the death penalty by agreeing to plead guilty. Life in prison without parole was the only outcome left. And so, after 40 years, the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the man who had once terrorized California, was sentenced to die behind bars. The courtroom exhaled as if releasing decades of tension. For the first time, victims and families could finally look at him and know that the monster was caged. But the legacy he left behind was more than the horror he created. His capture had reshaped the very science of criminal investigation. The use of genealogical DNA had opened a door that could never be closed. After DeAngelo's arrest, other cold cases began to crumble. Long-forgotten murders, rapes, and disappearances suddenly had new hope. The Golden State Killer hadn't just been caught, he had changed the way the world caught killers forever. In the months after his conviction, reporters and criminologists tried to understand him. How could someone who once wore a badge turn into a predator? Some pointed to his time as a police officer, the control, the power, the access to people's lives. Others saw the signs of a man obsessed with domination, someone whose rage grew each time he escaped consequences. But the truth may never be known. DeAngelo never explained, never confessed beyond his plea. He sat in silence, aging in a prison cell, the same silence that once followed him through dark hallways and quiet neighborhoods. For the victims, closure didn't come easily. Justice doesn't erase the memories. It doesn't rebuild the years lost to fear. But it does something small. It lets them breathe. One survivor, now in her 60s, said it best, "He took everything from me. But I'm still here. And he'll die in that cell. That's enough." DeAngelo's arrest also brought long overdue recognition to the investigators who never gave up, especially the women and men who fought through skepticism, lack of funding, and decades of dead ends. Their persistence, paired with modern technology, finally ended one of the darkest chapters in California's history. And so, the Golden State Killer's story closed, not with another scream in the dark, but with the sound of a cell door slamming shut. In prison, DeAngelo barely spoke. He refused interviews, refused eye contact. The man who had once toyed with his victims now lived out his days surrounded by concrete, under constant watch, powerless. His crimes had stretched across generations, haunting California like a curse. But in the end, time caught up. Technology caught up. Justice caught up. And while his victims may never forget, they no longer have to look over their shoulders. The monster who once stalked their nights is gone, locked away, his name remembered not for power, but for the pain he caused and the justice that finally found him. Because in the end, no matter how long evil hides, it always leaves traces, footprints in memory, fingerprints in DNA, and a legacy that says this: you can run from justice, but you can't escape it forever. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more chilling true crime stories.